Hey everybody, today we are out here taking a look at the lightly refreshed 2020 Toyota CHR, Toyota's entry in the fast-growing subcompact crossover segment. For 2020, there aren't too many changes to the CHR, so this video is going to be a little bit shorter than normal, and we're going to focus mainly on comparisons. We do have a slightly tweaked front end, we have a few extra features, and we have Android Auto capability on the inside, but aside from that, the CHR is relatively unchanged from the last time we took a look at this model back in 2018. The most important takeaway from that is that the CHR still does not offer a hybrid system like we do find in other world markets, and it still does not offer all-wheel drive, something that we do see in a wide variety of other subcompact crossovers. The CHR was, interestingly enough, originally designed to be a Scion in America. That's not too obvious from the overall design because this definitely looks an awful lot like the last generation Toyota RAV4, but really in the overall pricing and structure of the CHR lineup. It really is value priced, there are only 3 different trims, and there really are very few options to pick from at all. For 2020, the big change is that the base model gets LED headlamps, but not the LED headlamps we see in this trim. These are the up-level projector headlamps that we only see in the limited trim, and then the bumper does change down here at the bottom. It's a little bit more chiseled, it's a little bit lower, giving it a slightly more aggressive look overall. But the radar sensor right there behind the Toyota logo is standard. Having a standard radar sensor for autonomous emergency braking isn't too uncommon for 2020, but Toyota gives all CHR models full speed range adaptive cruise control standard as well. Now you don't get blind spot monitoring until you get up into the XLE and limited trims, but even the base LE trim comes very well equipped from an active safety perspective. If you're looking for an inexpensive car with predicted high reliability and all of the latest active safety technologies, the CHR should definitely be on your list for that. In terms of overall length, the CHR is a little on the long end of the subcompact crossover segment, and the overall profile reminds me a little bit of something like the Subaru Crosstrek, because this does come across as more of a lifted hatchback than a boxy subcompact crossover, something like the Ford EcoSport, for instance. Now, when this model first launched in America, there was a lot of debate. Can the CHR even be called a crossover because we don't have all-wheel drive available? Well, to be perfectly honest, the term crossover is entirely a marketing creation, so if Toyota wants to call this a crossover, that is entirely fine by me, but I do have to admit that the lack of all-wheel drive is a little bit disappointing. Toyota says that the logic for this is that most subcompact crossovers in America are not purchased with all-wheel drive. And indeed, that's something that we hear from just about every manufacturer of subcompact crossovers out there. For instance, Hyundai said that in the subcompact crossover segment, 60% of the vehicles that they see going out the door are front-wheel drive, and that's why the all-new Hyundai Venue is available as a front-wheel drive vehicle only. But on the other hand, Hyundai does have a subcompact entry, the Kona, in this segment with all-wheel drive, and I really wish that Toyota had offered that in the CHR. The overall design is definitely attractive. It's definitely a little quirky, but attractive. We have door handles for the rear doors really high up there in the rear. I think that particular styling twist is kind of unusual because if you're going to be putting kids in the back, then kids are going to want to grab a lot lower on the door than that handle right up there, but the front door handle is in a very normal location. Moving to the rear, we still have this same chunky styling that we saw before. There have been a few things that have been slightly tweaked, but the changes are very, very minimal on the outside of the CHR overall. These are combination LED tail lamp modules, so the brake lights only are LEDs. The rest of the module is incandescent. If you want full LEDs, you will have to shop somewhere else. You can look at the CHR as an upgrade from something like a Toyota Yaris, or perhaps an alternative to something like a Toyota Corolla, because under the hood, like many subcompact crossovers in America, we find a little bit more power than you'd find in the average subcompact sedan or hatchback. This engine is essentially the engine out of the last generation Toyota Corolla. It's a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. It produces 144 horsepower and 139 pound-feet of torque. That's notably more power, nearly 50% more than we find, for instance, in the Toyota Yaris hatchback. So the CHR is definitely going to feel peppier than that hatch, but it's going to feel a little bit different than something like a Toyota Corolla because the Corolla currently gets a newer generation of the engine and transmission that we find under this hood. The only transmission on offer is a CVT, but again, this is not the same CVT that we find in the Corolla. That is the updated next generation of the one that we find under this hood. Front seat comfort in this limited trim is pretty good. We have a 2-way adjustable lumbar support and a power driver's seat with a little bit more motion than we find in all subcompacts out there. So I'm going to give this seat a 10 out of 10 score when it comes to front seat comfort. We also have a tilt telescopic steering column with a moderate range of motion. If you're looking for a crossover with a very upright seating position, you may want to look somewhere else. The CHR really seems to be designed to feel a little bit more like a hatchback, perhaps a little bit more like a sedan on the inside. So the driving position is a little bit more reclined. You'll notice my legs are definitely sticking out a little bit further in front of me than we would find in something like a Jeep Renegade. Hopping into the back seats, you'll notice that overall combined legroom is definitely on the lower end of the subcompact crossover segment, even though the CHR is on the longer end outside. That really plays into the more cramped feeling we have over here on the right side if I were to try and squeeze behind the front seat that's all the way back in its track. You'll definitely find more legroom in something like the Honda HR-V or the Kia Soul, but overall headroom is pretty decent back here. If I lean all the way back in this seat, my hair is just barely brushing the ceiling. I have probably about 3/4 of an inch of headroom left. You'll also notice that the rear seats feel a little bit wider than the average subcompact crossover, likely because this is closely related to the Toyota Corolla and of course the Toyota Prius, which are a little bit larger. Behind the rear hatch, we find a little bit less cargo area than you might suspect based on the overall outside dimensions of the CHR. That's mainly because of the way that they've chosen to really rake the rear end and give it this more aggressive back end look with the integrated spoiler right there on top of the hatch. As you can see, that means that the cargo area is simply not as square as some of the boxy alternatives. We do, however, find a spare tire under the load floor and a little bit of additional storage space. As we look around the interior, keep in mind, of course, that we are in the top-end limited trim. It's obvious in here that Toyota went for a really stylized interior. The same pattern that we see in the button modules, we also see embossed into the ceiling right here. It kind of fades as we go rearwards. Driver and front passenger get height-adjustable shoulder belts, seat designs with a pretty aggressive shoulder right there, and two-way adjustable headrests. Since we're driving the limited trim, we do have the leather-trimmed upholstery. These front seats are perforated in a diamond pattern that sort of matches the embossing that we find up there on the ceiling. We also have some perforated sections on the outside, and then that continues as we move down to the seat bottom cushion. The bolstering is fairly aggressive for a Toyota vehicle. It really makes us feel a lot more comfortable out on the road. Moving over to the front doors, we have again more of that same pattern going on there. This insert in the center is a hard plastic, but we do have some soft touch plastics up above, and of course for that armrest right there as well. There's also a bottle holder down there in the door along with the speaker grill. The overall design definitely has a youthful feel to it that we don't see in other Toyota models, but I have to say that something like the Honda HR-V does have a slightly more premium feel overall. I really like the fabric inserts that Honda has chosen to do with that particular interior design. Over to the dashboard, we have a soft touch injection molded upper section right here. This has the appearance of stitching, but it has just been injection molded into the plastic, but the overall design definitely makes this interior look a little bit more premium. We have the same sort of lines going across the dash that we find in other modern Toyota models. Below the black trim, we have another soft touch injection molded section right there, and then below that we have a bin style glove compartment. I was not able to fit a larger tablet computer inside, however. In the middle of the dashboard, we find a standard 8-inch color touchscreen infotainment system. This is one of Toyota's latest infotainment software packages, and it really is a nice asset, especially to the base model of the CHR. The Toyota interface is a little bit more convoluted than the interfaces that we see, for instance, in the Hyundai Venue, but the standard Apple CarPlay, Android Auto support, and of course Amazon Alexa support mean that you aren't really going to have to interact with those Toyota menus too often if you don't want to. We don't have a factory mapping interface in the system, but the physical map button will take you over to the mapping activated by the Apple CarPlay or Android Auto system. It's a really nice touch. And then of course the apps button will take you over to the integrated Entune apps that we find native in the system. Below the screen, we find two large air vents right there and a touch that we don't find in all subcompacts out there, which is dual zone automatic climate control. So if you're looking at upgrading from something like a Toyota Yaris, definitely keep this particular feature in mind. We also have heated seats up front available in 3 different levels. It kind of looks like they intended to give us ventilated seats, but there's no button right there. Under the climate controls, we have a single USB input for the infotainment system, a small storage shelf right there where you can't really put larger smartphones. It's just a little bit too small. And then a pretty large cup holder, but unfortunately the cup holder is immediately below this portion of the dash right here. So if you did have one of those larger or taller takeout drinks, they may end up hitting the dash right there. We have a console shifter here for the transmission, manual mode over to the left. We have an electric parking brake, auto brake hold, which is a nice touch, something that we also see in the Honda HR-V, button to turn off the traction control system, and then another large cup holder right here between the front seats. That's an awful lot more useful. The center console is softly padded, also is sort of half round shaped, which is kind of an interesting touch. It opens to reveal a moderately sized storage compartment, a little bit bigger than I had expected, and there's a 12-volt power port inside. In the middle of the instrument cluster, we find a standard full-color LCD that is kind of a rarity in the subcompact segment, and it's all because we have that standard Toyota Active Safety system in all models. It gives us G-vectoring readouts right there, fuel economy readouts, range, We also get the status of the active safety system and infotainment system as well. This is also where we change certain vehicle settings because they're not done in the infotainment system. The instrument cluster itself is a 4-dial design that doesn't look quite like anything else we find in the Toyota lineup. The steering wheel is a round 3-spoke design that's not shared with any other Toyota in the lineup at the moment. We have the cruise controls on a stalk right there, as we saw in older Toyota models, not on the steering wheel like we find, for instance, in the Camry. Since radar adaptive cruise control is standard, we have the distance button over here on the steering wheel itself. You can see that that stalk does move with the wheel as well. We also have a lane keeping button, the button for that multifunction LCD instrument cluster, trip button, and a back button. And then on the left side, we have the infotainment buttons. Again, that same sort of shape theme that we see going throughout the interior, dedicated phone buttons, and a voice command button as well. Because 2020 brought only cosmetic changes to the CHR, I'm doing something a little bit different here, and we're going to skip the drive section. Instead, I've just popped the numbers that we got the last time we drove the CHR right up there at the top of your screen. The overall scoring hasn't really changed. The CHR handles well for a base model thanks to its overall suspension design, but it does feel a little bit sluggish compared to the newer competition in this segment, especially turbo options that we're starting to find like the Kia Seltos and of course the Hyundai Kona. But moving into pricing, you'll see that the CHR really pushes back with a lot of bang for the buck. Starting at just over $21,000, the CHR has a lot of standard equipment. All that active safety tech we talked about earlier and the 8-inch infotainment system with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto is standard equipment for 2020. That puts the CHR ahead of the vast majority of the competition when it comes to overall value. The XLE trim is well priced also, starting at just over $23,000, and the top-end limited trim starts at $26,350. The limited trim doesn't really have many options. There are really just two. You can choose your paint color, including some of the two-tone options out there. There's also an upgraded audio system available in the limited trim, but even if you select that audio system and the most expensive two-tone paint option, you'll still end up under $28,000. That's a really narrow window between the bottom and the absolute top end. With that out of the way, let's move into the comparisons. Obviously, the first competitor here has to be the Jeep Compass because it is the best seller in the subcompact segment. The subcompact crossover segment has really been heating up. We have a ton of new entries and options available, but the Compass is the best-selling entry now, beating the Kia Soul. The Soul used to be the top seller in this segment. The Compass, like we see in the new Kia Seltos, is something of a tweener, so it's about 2 inches longer than the CHR, and the CHR is already pretty long for this particular segment, notably longer than something like the Ford EcoSport or the all-new Hyundai Venue, but still significantly shorter than a Jeep Cherokee. And the Jeep Cherokee is the Toyota RAV4 competitor. The Compass and theoretically the Renegade are both the Jeep competitors to the CHR. Now obviously we have all-wheel drive available in the Compass and a high amount of ground clearance. We also have more advanced all-wheel drive systems than we find in the average entry in this segment. So if you're really interested in taking your subcompact crossover more rugged off-roading, the Compass is logically going to be the best option for you. Now unfortunately we do get the ZF 9-speed automatic transmission, and that's not my favorite option. However, you can still get a manual transmission in the Compass if you're interested. Predicted reliability is likely going to be higher in the CHR, but you're probably going to get a better deal on the Compass. At the moment, Jeep is pretty aggressive both with finance deals and with cash on the hood, so you'll probably get more feature content in your Compass for the same dollar amount that you find in the CHR. It's also going to have all-wheel drive available, something that we don't see in the CHR at any price. The Compass is also pretty comfortable and relatively practically packaged. We have a lot of legroom on the inside, a lot of cargo room, and the squarer, boxier profile makes it a little bit more practical than the CHR. The second best-selling entry in this segment is the Chevy Trax, but I'm actually going to skip over the Trax because it's not new, and I suspect that the upcoming Chevy Trailblazer is actually going to beat the Trax in terms of overall sales. It's also a little bit less expensive, so a little bit more in line with what we see in the CHR. The Trailblazer bears no resemblance to previous generation Trailblazers. It really is sort of the new generation of the Chevy Trax. It was designed in South Korea, and it's actually built in South Korea as well for a worldwide audience. Perhaps the oddest thing about the Trailblazer is that the Trax is still on sale. The Trax is a little bit smaller overall, it's not quite as efficient as the Trailblazer, and it also is more expensive for some reason, even though it has less standard feature content. Now at this point in time, we haven't driven the Trailblazer. I was hoping to be able to drive that, but unfortunately some of the virus things that have been happening around the US have just put a lid on all launch programs, so we'll have to wait until we can get our hands on it for a complete week for a full video. However, expect it to be very similar to the Chevy Trax in terms of its overall design and overall performance out on the road. I've always liked the Trax in terms of overall value. It's a good solid option in this segment. It has been pretty reliable. It's not quite as exciting as some, but I think it definitely gets the job done. The Trailblazer looks like it's going to do all that with a little bit more style style and an awful lot more size on the inside. And that brings us along to the Honda HR-V, probably the most direct competitor to the CHR. When it comes to overall performance, there's no clear winner here. The HR-V is pretty sluggish, but it can have all-wheel drive, and that's something that, again, we are missing in the CHR. In terms of overall interior design, I find the HR-V just a little bit more comfortable than the CHR, but I like the CHR's design more than we find in the HR-V. It feels a little bit more modern, and we have that much bigger screen in the dashboard. It's also worth noting the HR-V does not give you Apple CarPlay or Android Auto standard for some reason. We also don't have Honda Sensing standard in that base model, so CHR is decently ahead of the Honda in terms of active safety. You also won't find standard LED headlamps on the HR-V, and I think the overall design is a little bit more boring compared to what we see in the Toyota. The CHR is definitely a little bit funky, a little bit more fun overall. Now on the downside for the CHR, the HR-V is much more practical. It has a lot of rear seat legroom and a huge cargo area in the back. And speaking of cargo areas in the back, that takes us along to the Kia Soul, the former bestseller in this segment. Whether you want to call the Soul a pregnant hatchback or a crossover, that's up to you, but it is front-wheel drive only, just like the CHR. As I've said before, in general terms, I don't think the lack of all-wheel drive is a huge problem for most Americans out there because the majority of subcompact crossovers are sold without all-wheel drive in the US. However, clearly that is a problem for people that live in the Pacific Northwest or in the Midwest in the US. Although we don't find the same kind of active safety content in the base Kia Soul that we do find in the base CHR, remember the price tag is an awful lot lower. And for similar prices, you will find similar equipment in the Kia versus the Toyota. We also find a slightly longer warranty in the Kia. Rather surprisingly, the base CHR, I think, beats the Kia Soul when comparably priced in terms of overall value. However, it is worth noting that by the time you get up to the limited trim of the CHR, you could get a turbocharged Kia Soul with 201 horsepower. That's definitely going to be an awful lot more fun than that top-end limited CHR. Bottom line here is that the CHR is an excellent value in base and limited trim, but I think things do fall apart just a little bit when it comes to that top-end limited model. The CHR has been practical, it's been reliable, it's also been a little bit more stylish than some of the other options in this segment, as long as you don't need all-wheel drive. The CHR also gives us pretty decent fuel economy, but it is worth noting that there are a number of entries in this segment that will beat the CHR when it comes to overall MPGs. In that vein, I kind of wish that Toyota had put their hybrid system under the hood of this model, particularly something like the Prius E all-wheel drive system that could have given it the sure-footedness of all-wheel drive with high fuel economy. I would really have been interested to see what that would have been like. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. And if you were shopping for a subcompact crossover in America, does the lack of all-wheel drive bother you? And as long as you don't need all-wheel drive, what would you choose in this segment? I do think the CHR is an incredible value. Let me know all that down there in the comment section below, and I'll see you all later.